Every year, Jewish families from around the world celebrate the deliverance of Israel from Egypt during the Passover feast. Records confirm that the Passover has been observed for thousands of years. Many believe it is difficult to explain the origin of Passover if there were no real event on which it was based. While in Jerusalem, Mahoney went to speak with Rabbi David Hartman, the founder of the Shalom Hartman Institute.
Each year, we celebrate the Exodus as if we were there. We were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt, and we dramatically celebrate the Passover Seder as if we are participants. So there's always a renewal, always a giving a new spirit into the Passover Exodus story. Because in remembering the Exodus, we remember that in the dark conditions of history, God, the Lord, had in some way made possible through Moses our liberation.
But what about those who think the Exodus never happened? Noted Israeli archaeologist Israel Finkelstein specializes in the ancient history of the land of Israel. In his influential book, The Bible Unearthed, he has argued that the Exodus did not happen in the manner described in the Bible. He proposes that it was based on vague memories of events written down for political motives centuries later.
Do you believe in celebrating the Passover?
Sure, celebrating the Passover, definitely. I think that I make a distinction in my private life, in my life as a scholar, in my life as part of a family. I make a very clear distinction between scholarship and tradition. When I sit to the Passover meal and we read the Haggadah with the family, that evening it's all history from A to Z. Perfect history. Because history is not only about, the time of Moses, let's say, okay? History is also about all those many generations of my forefathers who were sitting to the same table, in Passover at the same time and reciting the Haggadah. This is also history. And so, which means that I am part of something bigger, which goes on and on for many generations, and this is important for me. So, yes, the answer is that there is a clear distinction between the two.
What do you say to people who are concerned with the idea that these stories didn't happen as they were written?
I would tell them that this is not important. Whether things happened exactly in that way is not important. I think that it is more important to understand the meaning of Exodus, the moral of Exodus.
Rabbi Wolpe has said that Professor Finkelstein's work has greatly influenced his thinking.
The idea of the Exodus and the Revelation, however you configure it is central to the Jewish tradition, but I think that doesn't mean that you have to believe that the Torah gives a historical account of it. I don't think the Torah is a book of facts. It's a book of meaning.
However, John Bimson shared a very different view.
History and theology are tightly intertwined in the Bible. If you took away the historical basis, then you really deprived it of a lot of its theological truth. So much of what the Old Testament says about the character of God and his purposes in calling Israel are intertwined with this story of this people coming out of Egypt and entering the Promised Land. So history and theology are tightly intertwined in the Bible.
After more than a decade of searching, this is what it comes down to. Is the Bible's account true history, or is it simply the traditions of a devout people? If the judgment happened as described in the Bible, Egyptian society would have collapsed. Loss of their agriculture, loss of their firstborn sons, loss of their slave force, and the loss of their army. In fact, Moses recorded that Egypt was still suffering from defeat 40 years after the Exodus.
Critics are quick to point out that there is no such record from Egypt of supernatural judgment and devastation. But others believe there is an Egyptian document that actually gives an eyewitness account of the plagues and chaos surrounding the Exodus. Mahoney went to Holland to meet the curator of the Leiden Museum, where this significant papyrus is housed. But Egyptologist Martin Raven sees no evidence for the Exodus in this document or anywhere else.
The story of the Exodus is described in the Old Testament. It's part of the national history of the Jewish people, or so they say. We have no independent evidence that this is a real historical event. We can believe it because we believe in the Bible. There are no Egyptian sources that describe it. There are no other documents, there are no archaeological sources that could prove this took place as a mass exodus.
Raven's position, again, is that of most Egyptologists today. But there are some scholars who suggest that descriptions found in this Egyptian document bear a remarkable resemblance to the plagues of the Bible, only from an Egyptian point of view. Written by a scribe named Ipuwer, the papyrus known as the Admonitions of an Egyptian Sage poetically describes a series of calamities and the chaos that followed.
Ipuwer. We don't know who he was, but he was obviously somebody in a position to address His Majesty, the King. There's only one copy of this specific text, and that is here in the Leiden Museum. It's a very, very vivid report, or would-be report, of what happens to Egypt when the central power falls away.
Many believe a collapse of Egypt's power is exactly what would have happened due to the plagues of Exodus. And as I compared the book of Exodus to the writings of Ipuwer, I too was intrigued by the similarities.
To convince Pharaoh, God says, take some water from the Nile and pour it on the ground. And as it hits the ground, it will turn into blood.
Behold, Egypt is fallen to the pouring of water, and he who poured water on the ground seizes the mighty in misery.
And all the water in the Nile turned into blood, and the fish of the Nile died, and the Nile reeked, so that the Egyptians could not drink water from the Nile.
The river is blood. If you drink of it, you lose your humanity and thirst for water.
All the livestock of the Egyptians died. Fire ran down from heaven, and the Lord sent hail upon the land. Even the flax and the barley were smitten.
Gone is the barley of abundance. Food supplies are running short. The nobles hunger and suffer. Those who had shelter are in the dark of the storm.
I see no connection between the papyrus of Ipuwer and the story of the plagues of Egypt. It is in a way, but in a very indirect way, an eyewitness report of a historical period. It pretends to be such a report, but in fact it isn't.
At midnight, the Lord struck down all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh sitting on his throne to the firstborn of the captive in the dungeon.
Behold, plague sweeps the land. Blood is everywhere, with no shortage of the dead. He who buries his brother in the ground is everywhere. Woe is me for the grief of this time.
And there was great wailing throughout the land of Egypt, for there was not a house without its dead.
Wailing is throughout the land, mingled with lamentations.
All the time we have to convince ourselves that this person can't have seen all this. He imagined it, or he had received his inspiration from other similar propagandistic literature.
Because it's so fantastic.
Yes, it's very fantastic, but he hasn't seen it, he just imagined it. Don't confuse this with the message of the Bible, the 10 plagues. That's a quite different story. Whether this happened or not is irrelevant. It's a beautiful literary document. And again, yes, God was angry and punished the Egyptians, but this is just a literary cliché.
The influential Egyptologist, the late Miriam Lichtheim, ruled out the possibility that the papyrus, the admonitions of Ipuwer, referred to a real national calamity. Agreeing with other scholars, she stated the following.
The description of chaos in the admonitions is inherently contradictory, hence historically impossible. On the one hand, the land is said to suffer from total want. On the other hand, the poor are described as becoming rich, of wearing fine clothes, and generally of disposing of all that once belonged to their masters.
However, when you read the biblical account, it becomes clear how this apparent contradiction could have happened.
Moses told the Israelites to ask the Egyptians for silver and gold jewelry and for clothing.
People are stripped of clothes. The slave takes what he finds. Gold, lapis lazuli, silver, and turquoise are strung on the necks of female slaves.
The Lord gave the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, so they gave them whatever they asked. Thus they plundered the land of Egypt.
The very point that Miriam Lichtheim viewed as contradictory and therefore historically impossible is the very point that most specifically matches the biblical text. But Martin remains unconvinced. He revealed to me the main reason why.
It's out of the question that it can refer to one and the same event. Conventional chronology has it that the Exodus took place somewhere during the Ramesside period in Egypt, maybe around 1200 BC. Whereas our papyrus, when you look at the grammar and the literary figures, etc., there's no question that it was composed in the Middle Kingdom, and that is 600, 700, 800 years earlier.
But I realized that all the other evidence I had looked at was also converging in the Middle Kingdom, not the time of Ramesses. And was it just another coincidence that this document was originally composed in the only period when Egypt's delta was dominated by large numbers of Semites? It became obvious to me and my team that if people look at the wrong time in history for evidence of the Exodus, they won't find any. So Ramesses is a giant, standing in the way of connecting this evidence with the Exodus. And for over 50 years, all the books, all the television programs, and all the university professors who've been convincing the world to dismiss the Bible have been doing so based mainly on this one issue, chronology, the dates assumed for the Exodus, and the lack of evidence at the time of Ramesses II. But if it happened long before his time, then it means they're all wrong. Wrong about the Pharaoh, and perhaps wrong about the Exodus never happening.
Roll took Mahoney to see the replica of a monument erected just a few years after Ramesses' death by his son Merenta. It's important because it shows that Ramesses could not be the pharaoh of the Exodus, because in his time Israel was already a nation, established in the land of Canaan.
So this is the famous Merenta stela, or what we call the Israel stela. And it actually belongs to the king Merenta. Up there at the top you can see him facing the god Amun, and he lists in a poetic form all the different conquered nations, the nations that are at peace. But right at the bottom, we have 3 crucial lines, because this is where we find a link to the Bible. Let's read it together, okay? We have 2 reeds. That's the sound ye or I, okay? Then a bolt, which is S, an R, a mouth, an E, an A, and an L. Israel.
Israel.
Israel. This is the only time that we see this name on an Egyptian monument. After the name Israel are these 2 figures here, these 2 seated figures of a woman and a man, and 3 strokes underneath. These 3 strokes mean plural. So it means the people or nation of Israel. And then this is the interesting bit. It says, Fekti bin Peret Eth. Israel is laid waste, his seed is no more.
Well, does it mean they were literally no more?
No, it's a sort of poetical way of saying they've been overcome, defeated.
Or pacified?
All these phrases here are like that. It's a poetical phrase, effectively.
How significant is this then to the story of the Exodus?
Well, for me, it's very important, because if we're talking about Ramesses II or Meremptah being at the time of the Exodus of Moses and Joshua, this just does not fit the pattern. It's not tribes wandering around the Sinai, lost in the desert, or, during the wandering periods of Moses and Joshua. They seem to be a political entity.
This monument doesn't fit the idea of Ramesses being the pharaoh of the Exodus because it was written shortly after his death. And it recognizes Israel already existing in Canaan as one of the significant powers of the day. And that shouldn't be. Because the Bible says that the Israelites did not even begin to conquer Canaan until 40 years after the Exodus. So Ramesses could not have been the pharaoh who let the Israelites go. Then Mahoney got a lead about another inscription. Charles Ayling brought him to see his colleague, historian Clyde Billington, who has extensively researched this newly discovered find.
Besides the Merneptah stela, there's another reference to Israel. It's called the Berlin pedestal. It's in the State Museum in Berlin, Germany, and this is something that's just now being studied and discussed by scholars.
On the base of this Egyptian statue, they showed Mahoney name rings, each representing an enemy defeated by Pharaoh in the region of Canaan.
So would these have been captured people?
Realize that pharaohs all the time exaggerate, to say the very least.
So is he bragging?
He's bragging.
Okay.
He's bragging. He's saying, I've conquered these people, I control these people. This is the one that's caused all of the excitement because you have, again, a bound enemy. So telling you that these people are enemies of the Egyptians. And the name down here, that while it's partially broken away, has been reconstructed, and it's the name Israel. And this dates to around 1360. This makes the late date of the Exodus an impossibility. This is 100 years earlier.
This is very crucial evidence that we see here.
This name ring demonstrates that Israel had already left Egypt and was in Canaan as Egypt's enemy a century before the Ramesses Exodus date. So obviously, Ramesses could not have been the pharaoh of the Exodus. As another test to see whether Ramesses really was the pharaoh of the Exodus, Mahoney would need to find out if there were any signs of major problems during this famous king's reign, such as a sudden collapse of power that would match the biblical judgment of Egypt.
I don't see any evidence that during the reign of Ramses II there was a significant decline in the strength of the army, in the economic well-being of the country. I don't see anything in the succeeding reign of Merneptah either.
So you're saying there's some type of stability that was formed?
There was a great deal of stability during this period, had to have been for a lot of these things to have occurred.
But there's more. It came to my attention that the Bible itself contains a passage that's been largely ignored. It gives a date for the Exodus hundreds of years before Pharaoh Ramesses ruled. Yet it clearly says it was 480 years from the building of Solomon's temple back to the time of the Exodus.
Most scholars agree that King Solomon began his reign in 970 BC. So 480 years before this would place the Exodus around 1450 BC, 200 years before the Ramesses date. Yet the popular view continues to be that the Exodus occurred in the time of Ramesses.
It's a date that is based on very flimsy indicators. But this is where the majority of scholars look, almost out of habit, really. Earlier periods have just dropped off their radar.
And would you say that's the bottom line, why they don't find any evidence for the Bible?
I would, and I find it deeply ironic.
If I'm going where the evidence is strongest, then I've got to look beyond the Ramesses Exodus theory. And that's really encouraging, because it means that the events of the Exodus can be shifted 200 years earlier. But my challenge isn't over, because this new biblical date, around 1450 BC, still leaves the events separated from the Egyptian pattern by 200 years. I was determined to find an answer for this, and to do so, I would continue to explore the pattern that seemed to exist in the earlier period.
Is there any indication in the Middle Kingdom of the next step of the Bible sequence, a massive and sudden exodus following the death of the firstborn? Roll told Mahoney about something amazing that was found at Avaris.
We find an extraordinary thing happens. The archaeologists have been digging this area, suddenly find lots of pits in the ground. And in these pits are bodies, and they've been tossed into these pits. They're not buried formally. They have no grave goods or anything like that. These bodies are tossed on top of each other. They're lying strewn. You have hands and legs crossing over. What is happening here? What is going on? BTAC thinks it's actually some sort of plague that's happened, a dramatic event where suddenly they have to bury people very quickly because of contamination of the living population. So it's an emergency burial. And then, all of a sudden, all these Semitic peoples who were living there suddenly get up, they pack their bags and they leave, and the whole mound is abandoned. And we don't know for how long, and it just falls to ruin. Now, isn't that just like the story of Exodus?
"120 miles to the south of Avaris, another similar abandonment was uncovered at the town of Cahoon. Excavators found a walled and guarded settlement, which supported a large Semitic population. They also found documentation of slavery. Mysteriously, the inhabitants here seem to have disappeared overnight." According to Professor Rosalie David, the town's abandonment was sudden and unpremeditated. Their goods were found in the streets and houses of Cahoon, exactly where they were left, before being buried by the sands of the desert so long ago.
One of the great moments in Egyptian history is the collapse of Egyptian civilization, when these foreigners invade, these Hyksos rulers come in and destroy the land, and the Egyptian native rule is completely suppressed. Egypt is on its knees. That's what we see in the archaeological evidence at this period. And it only happens once in 1,000 years of Egyptian history. If we can link this to a very famous tradition told to us by an Egyptian priest called Manetho, he wrote a history of Egypt in the 3rd century BC. And what we end up with is a story like this. In the reign of a king called Dudimose, one of the last kings of the 13th dynasty, in his reign, God smote the Egyptians. And God here is singular. You would expect to see, and the gods smote the Egyptians, but you don't. You see God smote the Egyptians. And then, because of the smiting, whatever the smiting is, foreigners, people of obscure race, invade Egypt from the north. And they conquer the land without striking a blow, is the term. Why? Because God smote the Egyptians. Something had happened to devastate Egypt, which made them unable to defend themselves. And these marauding hordes took over the whole country. And we call this the Hyksos period. And they enslaved the Egyptians. But the point is, they could have defended themselves. They had a mighty army, except for the fact that God had smitten the Egyptians.
The earlier pattern of evidence for the Judgment and Exodus steps includes a Middle Kingdom papyrus that describes events remarkably similar to the biblical plagues, grave pits filled with bodies hastily buried, mass abandonment at Semitic sites in Egypt, an Egyptian source outside the Bible stating that a powerful God acted in Egypt's history, delivering a deadly blow which led to an invasion by foreigners. And all this coinciding with the only collapse of Egyptian society in 1,000 years.
You look for a collapse in Egyptian civilization, and that's where you'll find Moses and the Exodus.